The coffee and the tea and snacks are already outside. People are going and having a coffee. In interest of the time, we're trying not to have a formal break. We'd like to continue. So, the session that I'm going to moderate is about the deliberation. So, as you just witnessed, the first session was about to see what actually happened during the Nepal earthquake. So this session that now I'll be moderating would be more about the role of ICT, the disaster management, and what are the emerging paradigms. So before I start, just a few notes. We have this Twitter wall here. I can see a lot of tweets coming in. Our official hashtag is INATKTN. So please be part of it, and you can see yourself this little wall of fame. And we'll encourage you to just keep on tweeting because people are following us. We're also having a live stream, and I just saw the participants. We have around 26 to 27 people who are watching us live as well, so that's another thing that is happening at the moment. This session that I'm going to moderate, I'll try to be more interactive, so since we missed the question answer opportunity in the first session, I would like to invite you and encourage you to have your questions during the discussion. So during this moderation and discussion, whenever you feel that there is a question or you want to just jump in, please just raise your hand and you'll have the microphone at your place. In case not, I'll enforce you to have some questions, so bear with me for that. I have 4 panelists with me, which I'd like to invite. The first one is Amitabh Singhal, who is the Board of Directors for Public Internet Registry. So Amitabh, if you can join us. My second panelist is Meghan Sattler from the Emergency Telecommunication Cluster. I think we should clap so that we have encouragement. Thank you. My third panelist is Mahabir, head of the Nepal Wireless Networking Project. I assume probably he has left the room for coffee, so let's hope that he'll be back and can come and join us. My last panelist is Mr. Suman Basnet, the Regional Coordinator for World Association of Community Radio Broadcaster. Suman, if you are with us. Okay, so we'll start and hopefully Mahabir will join us shortly. There you are. Thank you. Alright, so to start with, I'll just come to the first panelist, Amitabh. You've been doing some work regarding disaster recovery and management in India. So if you can just quickly share some of your experiences from India, which is of course a very large geography, has more challenges in terms of the remote or marginalized communities. And you know, it's not only the earthquake, we have different levels and different sides of disasters. It could be floods, for example. So if you can just briefly tell us about what was your experience of using ICTs for disaster management and recovery in a few parts of India.
Thank you, Naveed. Fellow panelists, distinguished guests. Pleasure to be here back in Kathmandu after a couple of years and among friends to share the experiences that Naveed is talking about in terms of disaster management. I used to run a company along with a partner of mine. Basically, we were doing some projects on disaster management, some parts of it. It's a large subject. So, one of the projects that we had undertaken under this company was to set up emergency operations center for the Delhi Disaster Management Authority. To give you a background as to what this was all about is, India, actually being a large country, does have a very formal setup in terms of a National Disaster Management Authority. So there's a policy framework which is in place, Prime Minister's office, and they have policy frameworks, they have regulations around it, they have plans for a national disaster communication network, which goes down to the district level. So, and we have a few thousand districts compared to 75 in Nepal. And each district is headed by a district collector. So the disaster management plan actually goes down to that level, at the district level. And each district has its own plan in terms of mapping its resources, people, communication, the technologies that we have in that particular district. They have the demographic information. They have information about the geographical, the special data they need to have. So all the information about district that is possible is available and mapped. Okay, in terms of the resource that they can tap into with the disaster. So in terms of preparedness, which is one of the cycles of disaster management, is something that India has tried to prepare very well. So our role was to facilitate one district, which is the Delhi, which is the national capital, and we have this 1077 helpline number in terms of response to people who could dial into that emergency communication network to report a disaster or incident. And it was a call center which is manned 24/7 and with EPBX connected to a network which had a software that we developed. With that software, what would happen is that someone who would call in with the incident would actually be mapped as to where he was calling from. He would be basically traced in terms of where the incident happened, what kind of incident it was, and depending on the kind of incident, the software would pick up the responders list. And through a GSM modem, it would actually then communicate to the responders the type of incident and where it was happening, so that rapid action could be taken in terms of responding to the incident site. So a team would gather, they would get, then there was this whole formal escalation process. In case there was a gap in terms of response, then it would be escalated to the higher authorities. So the entire system was automated by us. And that is what we ran for a few years. So what we realized was that it is very important to kind of be prepared in terms of all the cycles that we have in terms of disaster management. So we have preparedness, we have mitigation techniques, we have risk reduction, you have so many of these 6 or 7 different cycles, and they are all overlapping each other. So that you don't go into serial mode, but you kind of attack these kind of all these cycles parallelly. Okay. So to prepare ourselves before a disaster, and then be prepared for the post-disaster scenario. So that was one experience that we have had. The second experience I would like to recall is also which would be relevant is about the floods that you mentioned. So we were tasked with to do research and prepare a report on mainstreaming a community which was very, very vulnerable. Now, as you all know, when a disaster happens, the most vulnerable community is the poor and below poverty line communities. Okay, they are the ones who actually lack any kind of infrastructure in terms of technology that is available to them. They do not have access to internet, for example, that we have been talking about. They do not. A lot of these communities are in the remote areas. So this community that I was researching was based about 100 kilometers from the capital city of Uttar Pradesh, which is Lucknow. And this is a village where they had no electricity. But the village had mobile communication. So people had mobile phones. And the demographics was such that it was near a river. And the most poor section of the village people lived near the river. And every year, they would be affected by floods. So there would be a flood every year in the month of June. And most of their property would get washed away. The cattle would get washed away. So it was a major loss to the community. So how do we mainstream them into the disaster management process is what our task was. So I went there, I kind of mapped the whole environment, and what we realized was, first of all, what was the reason for the regular floods, right? Now 100 kilometers upstream of that village was a barrage, which probably touches the border of Nepal, and they would release the water from there, okay? And they have sensors at the barrage which could actually sense the rising level of waters. However, that information, even though it was available, would not reach that vulnerable section of society who were living on the river banks. Okay, what was happening was a typical bureaucratic process where the information of rising level of water would actually flow to the capital city, to the state headquarters of the disaster management authority. However, by the time it percolated down to the village level, it never reached the so there was a system where they could actually use mobile phones to communicate the rising level of water. But within 4 hours, when the village was hit by the water, they would not even get the information. Okay, so what we did was to actually reverse the process and recommend that you have technology available with you, which is mobile phones, which was very effective in terms of disseminating information prior to the disaster occurring, okay, and prevent a lot of loss and damage. So instead of routing the information to the state and down to the village, and within the village there are so many hierarchies, we kind of said, okay, use mobile phones to straight away broadcast the information, which could be done immediately. So 4 hours if you have for the villagers to respond, they could actually evacuate and then say this is all confirmed. So these are the kind of experiences we have had. So what I realized is that there are multiple technologies when they talk about, from satellite to internet to mobile phones and to VHF, UHF. However, the use and how we use that to actually empower communities is much more important in mitigating a hazard turning into a disaster. Okay, so
yeah, so I think I'll take it from there. You say that there are technologies, there are platforms that are available. Important thing one is that we have a very streamlined channel, so we are able to directly communicate with the communities. And secondly, of course, we empower the communities as well. So, my next question will be from Meghan. Since you've been working with the communities, and I believe that you have a very diverse kind of experience in the region and globally as well. So what has been your experience in terms of the behavior from the community when they are being struck by a disaster, and how adaptability is coming up in their own area to use the ICT to help themselves, and they don't have to actually rely more from the government side. So is there empowerment coming up in that community? What do you think is happening these days?
It's a great question, and I think it's something that as the emergency telecoms cluster we're trying to focus on more and more. Globally, but also in Nepal, some of the lessons that we've seen after emergencies have been that when people can't communicate, they can't really manage their own responses to disasters. Something that was really interesting in the Nepali context was when I was here in September and I was speaking with communities in rush hour, and I was asking them a question, which was, after the earthquake, would it have been better for you to receive ICT in terms of the capacity to communicate rather than the aid that you've received immediately in terms of food and water? And someone turned to me and said, well, that's not really a legitimate question because we didn't get any aid in the first few days because we couldn't tell anyone where we were. And I think that's sort of the premise of the new strategy that we are now trying to implement as the Emergency Telecoms Cluster, moving from serving purely emergency responders in the immediate aftermath of a disaster and looking at how can we ensure that we can equip communities to be able to communicate faster, which enables them to access aid that the international aid system doesn't actually necessarily need to provide. A very good example in this country is diaspora and the amount of people here who access funds from overseas who have family members working in Dubai or Rome or wherever it is. When those people couldn't use their 3G after the internet, they couldn't have money transferred, and it kind of cut them off from aid that they could have received that didn't have to come from us per se. So it's definitely a big question.
Yeah, that's an important side of it, that how do we empower the communities who don't have any connectivity, but they still might have some devices that can communicate among themselves. We had this example from Hong Kong where they had this internet picked on for some time, and then they gave a chat application which was enabling that community to still talk to each other through chat and all that. So that's an important aspect, I'd say, which could be taken into consideration. I'll now move to Mahabir. from your rich experience of wireless networks, and you see now the Wi-Fi is really coming up as a technology or as an alternate platform to at least connect some side of a geography, a small community, a village. And you've been doing so much of work in Nepal with regards to wireless networks, especially in the remote and hilly side of this country. What do you think is needed to be done in Nepal, for example, to make sure that those networks which have been formed are used during such disaster situations? So I'm just if you can maybe share some stories as well. What kind of help was brought by those networks that you've been creating, or what do you think is still needed to be done using those networks, which can still help those marginalized communities in Nepal, for example?
Thank you, Naveed. I was in Kathmandu when the earthquake hit last year in Nepal. So within 5 minutes of the earthquake, I got a call from my yacht farmers up in the mountain saying, they said, okay, we got very big earthquake here. There is a big landslide we see on the other side of the mountain. What do we do? They were a little bit scared, when the earthquake hit. And I asked them, not to be scared much. And I told them that we also got, big earthquake here in Kathmandu. So communication is very important, during the time of earthquake or any kind of natural disaster. That time I was in Kathmandu in Park Bazaar, and most of the internet services were down there, so I could not check emails and the internet here in Kathmandu. But even if there was a jam in making mobile call, I became able to talk to some of the villages where we had wireless network to get internet, and I talked with them and asked them if the internet is running or if the network is up there. So luckily, the most of the internet services or most of the wireless stations we had in the mountains were up, except in 3 places in the villages. So my experience is during this time of natural disasters like the earthquake, the wireless network in the rural areas can help. Here in our case in Nepal, we were lucky because we got 7.8 Richter scale earthquake, and we didn't get 9 Richter scale, the huge one. We could imagine what it would have been like if we had got like a big earthquake, and if all these mobile towers were down. So, but in our case, even if there was the mobile services, some of them were down, but many of them were up, and we could still communicate. Based on my experience, what I see is it's not only during this time of natural disaster. I can give an example of at the time of say political disaster. The wireless network can be useful. When the king imposed emergency in 2005 or 6 sometime that time. I had to build some wireless network in the mountain that time, and all this TV and communication services, telephone, everything were down here, and nobody could communicate with each other. That time also, the my network in the, up in the mountain, in the remote areas was still running, and people could communicate with each other, and I could communicate with the villages at that time. So the wireless network like that can be very useful. As soon after like 2 days after the earthquake, 2 or 3 days after the earthquake, the vice chairman of National Planning Commission, they invited some of us, to discuss about, how, we can plan to for the rescue efforts and for the recovery efforts. So that time I suggested the government, to build broadband wireless network in the rural areas. So I suggested them to do that because building a wireless network like that doesn't take much time. It doesn't cost much money, but it can be very useful for communication within the disaster area or outside the disaster area. That's why I recommended to do that, and I recommended to build a broadband internet network in these 14 districts hit very hard by the earthquake. So I am not a big operator. I just have built some wireless network, and based on that limited experience, I can tell that a wireless network or broadband network in the rural areas will be a supplement of the communication services. To do that, I also recommend to use especially the low frequency TBY space frequencies for building the broadband network. Use that network for bringing internet and for emergency communication services as well. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So, the countries like Nepal, where we have a penetration of say 20-25%, still means that 75% of the population needs the connectivity, and that is the first basic point or first basic thing to do when we talk about doing the relief activities using the communication networks. Unless and until you have those networks being deployed, and as you said, broadband wireless networks using the TV white spaces could come very handy in countries like Nepal, who are still struggling in terms of the access, in terms of the penetration, in terms of the population percentage that has or can use internet. So thank you, Mahabir, for your input on that. I'll now switch to Suman. So radio networks are also very handy. We might have the cables cut down, we might have other physical infrastructure going down during disaster situations, but generally airwaves can still float throughout the whole country. So what you have actually felt the usage of radio communications or amateur radio network or even the radio stations in such situations, and again especially talking from the developing country aspect where we still have a good radio is still there. People still listen radio. There are FM stations, there are AM stations, or whatever. So how do you see that fitting in such recovery, mitigation, and all those different pillars of the whole disaster management ecosystem? What do you want to share with us?
I think I would like to say that radio, and especially locally owned community radio, is the most prominent manifestation of ICT at the grassroots. But before I go any further, I think I should acknowledge that I'm very happy and pleased to be amidst very eminent panelists and equally eminent participants. I'll be speaking, Naveed, strictly on behalf of community broadcasters and community radios. Just for those of you who may not know, community radios are little, small local radios that are mostly owned by NGOs and cooperatives. In the case of Nepal, the ownership varies from country to country. There are campus radios, there are radios also owned by religious organizations. in the aftermath and during systems and for promoting enhancements, for promoting preparedness. I think it was, I think one should call it an unfortunate coincidence that now we have examples from Nepal. There are several real-life examples from the post-April 25 earthquake in Nepal to reinforce the role of local broadcasters in a disaster situation, especially from places like Chaudhara, Dharin BC, the Gorkha market, and some parts of Golkha districts where radios did play an exemplary role in helping in the entire process, starting from the rescue and relief operations until now, as we are looking forward to the reconstruction process to take off. In fact, in some places, the radios came under tremendous pressure from the authorities and agencies that were providing the rescue and relief operations, as well as from the community members to come into operation, to come up on here as soon as possible. And some radios were taken a little longer because of difficulties, humongous challenges, because the radios, like everybody else, everything else had fallen down, the equipment had been damaged, there were personal tragedies suffered by the staff and so on. But nevertheless, I think the radios played an excellent role in, and I don't think I need to go into the details as to what they were doing, but definitely they were helping with the immediate rescue and relief work. They were acting as bridges between agencies providing the support for rescue and relief and the community members, linking them together so that the flow of information could be taken forward. I think some of the earlier presentations in this seminar today have indicated or hinted. I think there was one particular hint in Dr. Vaidyanathan's presentation where he mentioned Radio Singhal in Chaudhara, which is a fantastic example of how community radios at the time of disaster in the immediate aftermath played an important role. And mind you, these are radios which have suffered tremendously, as I said. To take the example of Radio Chaudhara, it was functioning out of a tent. The building had collapsed completely. The antenna of the radio station was set up on a bamboo pole. The inverter had to be shared with the rest of the community so that they could come. The people nearby could come and use it for charging their own mobile phones, because you know those little radio receivers that people usually have at their homes had been lost with everything else during the disaster. And even otherwise nowadays, more and more people, especially the youngsters, are using their mobile phones to listen to radios. But if you cannot charge your mobile phones, then how do you listen to the radio? So, you know, it kind of came down upon the radios to not only begin broadcasting despite the difficulties that they themselves have faced, but also to help community members to recharge their mobile phones so that they could benefit from the broadcast. You see, as I said earlier, community radios play one of the most significant roles the community radios play once the relief and rescue operations have phased out is to be a very strong bridge between the authorities, the agencies, and the people. And especially once the reconstruction process has started in earnest, which then brings up the question of accountability. And community radios in the context of Nepal, not only in the context of Nepal, but in the context of many similar countries, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, are the only platforms where community members can actually come and ask questions. You see, that is, along with, I think, some of the examples given here earlier about Twitter and cyberspace, I think community radio is a solid platform where community members can question certain things being done or not being done in the communities, and also express their opinion regarding the entire recovery process. So from that angle, community radio is really vital. In between, the role of the local media in discouraging rumor mongering or profiteering or panicking among the people is quite effective, and we really have a lot of real life experiences and examples to support that. So you see, community radios in Nepal, there are about 60 community radios actively in operation in those 14 earthquake-affected districts of Nepal. Played all of these roles that I just cited very effectively, mainly out of their eagerness, to be of service. However, having said that, I don't know if I can go a little further, but I would also like to point out that to a very large extent, although I said that the radios were extremely eager to be of service and they really did their best despite all the difficulties, I think we must also admit that we were really lucky this time. I think this whole issue of luck and being fortunate has been presented here from different aspects, and I would also like to re-emphasize this particular terminology in the context of radio broadcasting at the local level, because as we look back, I say lucky because the radios suffered, the losses they suffered could have been a lot more. The fact that the mobile networks were not damaged to the extent that the damage could have been was also, I think, a lucky stride. The fact that electricity in many places came back quite soon was another very fortunate event. All of that helped the radios to come back on air as soon as possible. But as we look back now and as we try to analyze what happened then and how the radios fared in that situation, we see that our preparedness was really to the minimum. We were not located in safe places to start with. Most of the buildings collapsed. Most of the radios that came back in operation were operating out of tents in many other districts, not just in Singhal or in Sattler. We were not using portable equipment, which should have been common sense really. Instead of using desktop computers, why not use laptops if they do the same kind of work? Similarly, you have portability in many other kinds of equipment that radios generally use for their everyday broadcasting. The radio staff were barely trained to deal with.
So I just going to because preparedness is of course the next thing that I'll come in and I'll see how ICT comes into play when we talk about the preparedness. When countries like Nepal experience such a devastating incident, what do you learn out of it and how you apply ICT to be better prepared? So I'll come to that later. I'll now come to my audience here. Any questions at this point in time? You have heard from all the four panelists, and you see they bring different and diverse experience and context in this discussion of using ICT for disaster management. So I'd just like to see if there are any raise of hand for any question or maybe any comment that you want to put at this point in time. And I can see Nick has raised his hand. So can we have the microphone passed to Nick?
Yes, thanks. This is for ETC. I think I know the answer to the question, but many people in the room may not. I know in the ETC 2020 plan there is a proposal for a pilot project here in Nepal. Is that still the case? And perhaps you might want to tell everyone a bit about it.
Thank you, good question. I might maybe start by just explaining very briefly what that strategy is for those who don't know about it. So the emergency telecoms cluster I know has been touched upon this morning, and Raj Kanal talked about it in terms of the response to the April earthquake. The way that the cluster has traditionally worked and the way that we worked after the emergency last year was essentially coming in under the Ministry of Information and Communications and setting up emergency connectivity in various sites so that humanitarian responders could carry out their work while there was no connectivity. What we have realised over recent years is that given the information and communications landscape globally, and just the prevalence of ICT, the way that now, ICT is not just reserved for responders per se. I mean, if there was an earthquake right now, I think all of us would run outside and the first thing we would do would be to check our phones, whether to let people know that we were safe or to find out what we were supposed to do. And that's what's happening everywhere. So after emergencies, we're not just being called upon to serve responders with connectivity so that they can send emails or do assessments. We're being asked to facilitate Wi-Fi hotspots for communities, looking at charging solutions, helping governments better in resilience, looking at preparedness and not just response. So essentially we have rewritten a strategy for the next 5 years that focuses on not just connectivity for responders but also affected populations and governments. And as part of that we are doing a pilot project in Nepal. We did some initial research to look at what were the biggest gaps in community communication after the earthquake. Most of the findings that came up have kind of been covered by this panel, so it's sort of good to have them validated in that way. Basically what we learned was that the majority of people here access information from local radio or community radio, followed closely by TV and then mobile phone and then face-to-face. The overwhelming majority of respondents to a recent survey used mobile phones immediately after the earthquake, but a lot of them couldn't because the networks were down. They were used to using 3G, which they couldn't use, which they cited as a big problem. An interesting thing about phone use in Nepal is that a lot of people say that they don't use the internet, but they use Facebook. So it's quite interesting to see how people understand prevalence of the internet as they use it on 3G and not on a computer. And also the role of the diaspora. We learned that damage to radio stations led to huge gaps in communication. Not just because radio stations were damaged, but even after they were up on the air again. I think you did mention this, that a lot of people now no longer access radio in the traditional way, but they access it via apps. And so even when radio stations were back up and running, and people could finally use their phones, by then there was a fuel crisis and they couldn't charge their phones, so they still couldn't use information. And that basically meant that there are a lot of rumours. And so based upon all this information, we thought, well, what can we do as the ETC to try and improve this? We're actually trying out a new model here, which is quite new for the cluster, where we're going to bring together at the local level a lot of key actors who are involved in this kind of information landscape. What we've realised is that people looking at internet prevalence are maybe not looking at community radio and where those two intersect. We also need to look at charging stations. Maybe people who have solutions in charging stations don't usually talk to ICT people. So we're partnering with World Vision Nepal's Innovations Lab to have a 3-day event where we're going to bring together as many of these key players as possible. Look at lessons learned from the earthquake, not just in terms of ICT, but specifically in terms of how ICT impacted communities after the earthquake and how people access information. And from that we will come up with some solutions, the top 3-ish of which will then be programmed by World Vision's Innovations Lab and funded. So we can see whether we can put some things in place that were devised at the local level that can possibly help with resilience or preparedness going forward. But there's a specific focus in this project on communities. So we're not so much looking at humanitarian response, but how people can access information as soon as another emergency happens. Could I just add one more thing to that?
Sure.
I think something that's become quite clear also, and I think in this room it's quite prevalent, if you look at the person next to you and consider their gender, I think the ICT kind of landscape in Nepal is pretty much 100 to 1 when it comes to male-female representation. And it was really interesting to hear the case study before of Twitter being used to ensure that women and children could better access aid. And that's one thing, the kind of the gender consideration in the landscape here is something that we really want to factor in when we're looking at solutions at community level. How can we make sure that those minority voices are better represented?
Exactly.
That's not the case with Nepal, but with India as well. It's the same thing. There's a gender inequality. As a gender inequality thing that you mentioned, Meghan, is not just the case in Nepal, but also in India. You'll find a similar situation there as well. So this region has certain similarities that one needs to be aware of.
Well, we have 3 women in our whole program, so I think we try to keep the balance for this island Kathmandu. Any other questions? Nick, is that the answer you were looking for? Okay. Any other questions? See, if you have asked a question, there are a lot of people watching it live, and they will watch you as well. So. Think it's going to get popular.
Yes.
Ah, okay.
One last question. You were talking about gender, and then something that came to my mind was about literacy. One of the problems that I'm addressing right now in my research is the use of pictograph in emergency communication, and especially for warning as well as conducting incident reports. Language diversity, migrant populations, all these need, and we see that like the Asian sub-Saharan Africa, 30% of the people are still illiterate. Have you thought of that, or did you capture any of that data in your surveys?
When you're asking this question to Meghan?
Yes, I mean basically for the implementation of our new strategy, we're having to partner with a lot of actors who perhaps we wouldn't before. What I was mentioning before about the way that the cluster traditionally works is very much looking at the kind of overall country infrastructure level. So we've been partnering a lot with people on the ground here, such as the Communicating with Communities Working Group, NGOs who've been doing a lot of surveys. So we've kind of started from how people access information, which has included the overall landscape. So things like people who are illiterate, whether they prefer to get information from radio or from pictures or whatever it is, which is actually part of a wider, probably, information survey. There's a survey that is about to be released, if it hasn't already, that has come out of the Resident Coordinator's Office, which is basically about communications lessons learned from the earthquake for communities. So that sort of information would definitely be included there. And what we're doing is taking that and then looking at what are the ICT considerations from within that. So it has been considered, and it's definitely being considered on a wider level than what we're addressing. But we're definitely making sure that we're starting from the basis of how do people access or prefer to access information, and then how can we contribute to that.
Yeah, so I'll come to you. Just give me. I just want to take some context from Mahabir as well. So you've been working very close to the communities. How do you see the shift is coming up from the gender side, for example, as well? How do you see the women, the kids in those remote areas, for example, in Nepal, are now having that interest to access technology, one, and to learn more about how they can raise those devices and all that. So do you see that change coming in, that interest in building up there?
Especially talking about my experience with with internet, bringing internet in the rural areas, I have seen there, especially the young generation, either they are boys or girls, are using equally the access to the internet, like using Facebook, using Viber, using Skype, email for communication. So I don't see, in the area where I work, I don't see any kind of gap, there.
Very nice. So, you want to add something?
Just wanted to relate one experience that I've had recently about the gender importance and their interest as they live in the children. I think one of the things that we notice is, of course, we just talked about the gender inequality in terms of participation, right? But then I'm actually right now doing a pilot project in the city of Pune, where I have Wi-Fi enabled the whole slum. Now, this is not the rural context which we talked about, but this is again another vulnerable section of society which is marginalized socially and economically, and women are the most affected part of that ecosystem there. So what I did was to go and Wi-Fi enable the slum. So whole slum with about 4,000 people, 1,200 families is now Wi-Fi enabled. Okay, so that's one of the most, I think that's the only example of a slum being Wi-Fi enabled. And I have a training center which I set up there. So people come in, about 100 people every day are being trained on user computers and internet. Now, to my surprise, within 2-3 months of starting that kind of project, what we noticed is that 48% of the participants in both the training programs as well as the use of internet were women and children. Okay, from that kind of a society where everyone tends to think that they are probably repressed, they are not allowed to go out of the houses, but they were the first ones to come and attend the training sessions, get certified. I have pictures I can share where we are certified for women. Not only that, within a month and a half of being first-time users of computers and internet, they were actually ordering hair dryers on e-commerce sites. Okay, which was amazing because for the e-commerce service providers, it became another surprise because they were not used to delivering in slums. Okay, so when you talk about information access and being empowered with all the information that they need to kind of take care of so many of these situations, including disaster, I think what we need to look at is the fact that if we provide access, demand will happen, and you can actually bridge that divide. So I think what we have been doing all this while is going with the bias that okay, this is a repressed section of this community, so they will not access or they will not demand. I think give them access and the demand will happen.
Yeah, that's true. So I'll just now come to you for a question.
Good afternoon. This is Ek Dubadi. Well, I'm just sharing my observation, and anyone can comment. Particularly in Nepal, there are more people who don't access internet. There are more digitally immigrants than the natives. In such case, how can the vulnerable group who are prone to disasters, not only the earthquake, there are floods every year, how can we make it more accessible and easy so that even the common people use it confidently? That's my question. Thank you.
If you can just narrate use of what? Use of technology, what you mean? It's like how we can make the use of technology more easier for those people?
Yes.
Okay. So,
for example, mobile technology.
Let's say, okay. We'll take this. Amitabh?
Yeah. If I understood this question right, he's saying that, okay, this is a region where penetration of internet especially is very, very low. Right? User technology is very low. Right? This is a society which has actually not been racially accustomed to using technology. Okay, so recently yes, we have seen a lot of proliferation of mobiles, but internet is still a long way off. So Nepal has about 25% penetration of internet. India has about 50 to 18%, which is even lower than Nepal. But in terms of volumes, when we talk about in India, we have 400 million internet users. However, these are basically mobile-based internet access. Now that's another gap that we have. In the sense that 80-85% of the population is not covered with internet access. And one of the things that came out from the discussion earlier was two things. When you are preparing for disaster and when you are preparing to respond to disasters that happen, internet access and technologies, of course, Wi-Fi, we talk about, and community radios. So these are the access methods which actually help to mitigate or prevent disasters from becoming bigger than they are. I think what we need to do is from a policy planning perspective. I think most of the governments tend to look at traditional methods of providing communication links, which is your optical fiber cables and we talked about projects that we have been rolling out. We've been talking about mobile networks, right? But the internet access is very, very poor. And I think part of the policy planning should also now adapt to the fact that internet is now a human right. Okay, so a lot more investment really needs to go into creating internet access in more and more areas which are not connected. Okay, so that's one thing that I think the governments have really not probably been as involved as they should have been. So while they're realizing that Wi-Fi access is a much more cost-effective, economical, and much more useful tool than most of the other methods of communications. Okay, so that's one area. Community radio is another thing. In India, there are just about 250 community radios for a country like that size. Okay, the reason? Regulations. I mean, it takes years to get community radio licenses for people. That actually, and you know, it's sad to see that so many NGOs, grassroots NGOs who are strapped for resources, struggling to get a license to set up a community radio for years. By the time they get the license, they're half dead anyways. So those are kind of policy perspectives of the planning process. They need to kind of consider and say, okay, how do we mobilize resources to create these access networks at the ground level and cover more and more communities. So, and we also have this whole geographical issue in the sense that we have hilly areas, we have topographies which are not only suiting all the technologies. So how do we assimilate all the technologies together to create a seamless network so that you get cheaper access for people? So that's I think the core that we need to look at.
Let me tell about the internet penetration rate in Nepal. According to the data given by Nepal Telecommunication Authority, the internet penetration rate is around 40%. But the situation is out of those 40%, 96% of those 40% are using mobile data, 2G or 3G. That means there are less than 2-3% people in Nepal who are being able to get access to the fixed line access to the internet. So that is, and most of these people who are using the internet, this 40% are in the urban areas. So there is very little, I would say less than 2-3% penetration rate of internet in the rural Nepal. To make it access, I think it's the responsibility of the government to make the internet accessible for the rural people or for the rest of this people population. So to do that, in Nepal, there are mostly the mobile operators and are working on it using like a 3G or 2G, but their services are not available in the remote rural areas. And also the commercial internet service provider, they are not going to the remote areas or the rural areas because it is not commercially viable for them or financially viable for them. So that is why to make the internet accessible first, the government needs to take initiative, and I have been telling this all the time to the government. Just the initiative of some people or some organized, some NGOs or INGOs or people like me is not going to bring changes. It should be the responsibility of the government, and also the government should give for the it's not only access for the training. Government should also run digital literacy program to make people learn how to use the technology and get benefit from it.
Yeah, this is right to the point. See, we have access obligations coming from the regulator, where a licensee has some obligations to meet. So I think there is a need to revisit those obligations maybe in such situations. So we have a more rapid interest coming from the operators to reach those, and especially as you said, mobile is the next tool. I mean, how fluently the kids and the young generation is being using mobile, it's really amazing, and that probably is the right way to concentrate in terms of access. And also maybe universal access fund or universal service obligations. I'm not sure how USO works in Nepal, but that's another handy tool which is there with the government to rapid this access issue.
when you talk about universal service operation, that touches now with me because India has a very established universal service operation framework where they have created a pool of huge amount of money to roll out the national fiber optic plan. Okay, the problem is that the plan, probably in terms of implementation, has taken years and gone nowhere near what it was supposed to do, that just to connect 600,000 villages, right? And the problem that still remains is last mile connectivity is always the biggest gap. So you may have a fiber optic network, or you may have a mobile network all across, spanning 60-70% of the country. But if you don't have the last mile connectivity, that is where the communities get left out. And that's where the government's role is very important. As Mahabir said, we have to get the government to understand, please invest in those last mile connectivities. That is where commercial guys will not go.
You want to answer? I'm sorry.
May I just very briefly, from the point of view of community broadcasters, excuse me, I would like to touch upon what Amitabh has already mentioned. It's very unfortunate that community radios in all of South Asia, in fact, and beyond that also, operate in two very peculiar kind of situations, which are best called as either no policy situation or poor policy situation. In Nepal became the first country in 1997 to begin community broadcasting with the advent of Radio Sattler. And over the course of years until now, we have close to about 150 radio stations, most of which are actually in operation. And unfortunately, the country does not have a community radio policy. The media policy, the Communication Act of this country does not recognize, does not give any distinct recognition to the community broadcasting, which basically means that in the eyes of the government, a very large commercial enterprise, a broadcaster based in Kathmandu or in a large city, and a small local radio station in some part of the district, there is no distinction. So the kind of taxes that are applied to those two kinds of radios are same, which is highly unfortunate. At the same time, in 2006, India became the first country to introduce a community radio policy, followed by Bangladesh in 2008 with the community radio policies. And at best, I think these policies can be called poor policies. There are such restrictions that seriously hinder a common person's access to community broadcasting. So I think this whole issue of policy, and in a situation where you are devoid of a policy, you're also devoid of any spectrum planning, for example. And that then brings you to spectrum planning for emergency times. There is no emergency frequency set aside, especially in cities like Kathmandu, where the entire spectrum is already taken up. The analog spectrum is what we use, and it's all taken up. So you cannot really have an emergency radio in a city like Kathmandu if there was a need. Hopefully not, but if a need is to ever arise in the future. So I think policy is really the need of the hour, the need of the moment, that we really need to have this immediately. Not just generally of ICTs, but also looking into the specific issues of community broadcasters as well.
Yeah, so I'll just add in. I think maybe I was discussing yesterday opening dinner with our speaker from Philippine government. We were discussing that. See, it's now the right time when the government or such organizations keep in mind that whenever the disaster hits, generally the first two things that we think about are food, is the food and the shelter. And technology is somehow is taken as a granted item. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is what I have experienced. So maybe this is the right time when technology gets the same level of attention and importance in terms when there are agencies in government or other agencies who are trying to help those communities who have been hit by disaster. So that's one point I just want to make. And secondly, a question, maybe if any of you would take that, is when we talk about digital literacy, and we know that this mobile and these tools are now in the hands of the population, and we have to actually inform them more how to use it more effectively. And this is very important, interesting, I would say. People differentiate between internet and Facebook in Nepal, which maybe means that for them mobile applications is a different thing altogether. Maybe the application side is a different thing, and internet is Google or something. I might be wrong, but it seems that from the survey they differentiate between Facebook or social media application and internet. So maybe that's another the point to ponder on is that do we need mobile applications? Do we need to develop such applications, knowing that people have mobile in their hands? And as Mahabir has shared some statistics as well, do we need to concentrate on developing some local applications which can help the community to better prepare, and in time of the disaster, have more better response as well. So that's one point that I would like any of you to answer. And second point is the digital literacy and capacity building. We know that the generation by themselves learn and they will come up. How important is the same capacity building exercise for the organizations, for the government side, who actually have to deliver? You know, so the Nepal police, we heard that there was a lot of use of social media, and they were very active to respond. But I'm not sure if all the organizations would be that capable. So how important is for those staff of government agencies or those agencies who have to deliver the disaster responses, that we should also make them learn about the technology and how it can be used to help the community. So these are the two different questions, and I'll just like to ask the panel, whoever wants to take any of them.
I might start. Just a couple of points on your first question about education. I think there were points from both the side of me about the need to kind of educate people in internet literacy. But I think one step back from that is understanding how people are actually accessing it now. Because I've realised even in the limited research that I've done here that we do tend to make a lot of assumptions, and it can be quite dangerous to make decisions based upon those. And one that I always like to share was that when I was talking to a family in Nepal in the Langtan region, and the daughter in the family had said to me, you know, we have a smartphone in the family, but I'm the only person who uses it for the internet. And that's very common in all the families in this area. And so then we went to see her grandmother, who was about 85, and who was completely illiterate. And the way that she used the phone was that she would use WhatsApp and Viber to make phone calls, and she didn't know how to read, but she used the symbols to push. And I was thinking, well, she is actually literate in how to use 3G, she's using the internet, but we never would have captured that in any kind of survey. And the other point that I just wanted to reiterate was your point about how people maybe don't know what capacities they have in the internet if they don't know it exists or how to access it. So it is part of that responsibility. Read the capacity building, I think I'm probably not the best person to answer this, but one thing that I've observed here is that there is so much capacity across different sectors and organisations in Nepal who don't seem to talk to each other. And I think that it would be really, really good for us when we think about preparedness at country level to think, starting from the communities themselves, you know, how do people access information? Who are the players involved in making that more accessible, and how do we get them around the right tables to make decisions, to work on joint plans, would just be one recommendation from me.
In 21st century, in the coming days, most of the people around the world will be using mobile, doing most of their things, most of their works and most of the communication, everything. So developing mobile app to get all these things that people need to do is very important, and I think there will be a lot of still, there are a lot of mobile apps coming up in future. People will be developing a lot of mobile apps. As for capacity building, I think in for Nepal and poor countries like Nepal, the capacity building should start from the schools, especially for the when children start going to school. It should start from that time. But here it will take a lot of time for country like Nepal because we don't have access to the internet, we don't have electricity in many of the villages. So step by step, the capacity building or the literacy, internet literacy program should start from the school. As part of the curriculum.
Excellent point. Okay, so any other questions at this point?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Mahabir, for correcting the data on the internet penetration rate. We have 46%, more than 46%. And it's a 2015 data actually. And the mobile penetration rate is 103, whereas the total is 109. And well, the thing is, I beg to differ a couple of points here. We are not poor. I can't say Nepal is poor. The thing is, look at our technology. Have you been to Basnet? Look at those architecture. Those are the technology that Nepalese have been building since a long time. And Nepalese have a kind of specific characteristics. They embrace any kind of new technology quicker than any other individuals in this part of the world. This is what my understanding is. You can find any kind of applications on Nepalese hands, not in these people. These people are educated and literate. Let me tell you, if you come across, go to the street, a hawker or a daily wages worker, 16 years old, a girl maybe, a boy maybe, ask him to have a phone. Yes. Look at his phone, our phone. It will be a smartphone. They will be using WhatsApp, Viber, Facebook, Twitter. Nepalese, there are about 38 lakh Nepalese in Viber alone. But the unfortunate point is, we are unable to utilize this huge mass of the youth. Those are using those kind of technologies. So my kind of not able to understand is, because you raised the issue like how police did it. But the thing is, we knew there is a young generation in our part of the country uses these kind of applications. But the point is, okay, that was used for the crisis, but who will take it further? For example, why we are not able to use free applications? Why we talk about developing mobile applications that cost money, okay? And in spite of having so many free applications, we are not able to capitalize it for the education that we are talking about. Why we don't have some kind of scheme that utilizes Viber for the 38 lakh youngsters who uses Fiverr for their education? Why we are missing this point? So this is my question to you on the floor. Thank you.
No, very interesting point. I think huge points in this. So very difficult to kind of do justice to one or two statements and answers. And I think the question that you asked is really, really huge and broad. So again, it's very difficult to kind of say that these are the tried and tested answers. It's a complicated situation where most of the agencies have their different networks to answer the question about how they are going to utilize the different networks that we have. So all of these networks actually probably function in silos. They are probably not talking to each other. If I look at the kind of use that we put to the technologies like satellite, for example, okay, radio, for example, usually licensed activities, regulated heavily, telecom, heavily regulated. Okay, so on the other hand is internet access. Now, once you are able to provide internet access, people get on the internet. Now, you are not just a user, but you are also a producer of content. Okay, so it's a two-sided market which is free for all to connect to. So I think what we need to understand is the strength of certain access mechanism, which is obviously the strength of the internet itself, and see that the other modes of communication, for example, the police network, how can it be used in conjunction with the public internet? Okay, probably that's not happening yet. We have not even given it a thought. But I think we are used to the mentality that okay, this is licensed activity, this is a closed network. Okay, so we need to open these networks. Especially, I think the starting point would be our lessons from the disasters that we face. And when we start talking about what we need to do, that's the right time to hit the iron is hot. So okay, let's open up the police network to talk or to let more people in the public communicate with the radio network and see how it can be better utilized. So for example, satellite radio, in this part of the world, it's not really there. Whereas it can play a big role, otherwise in terms of warnings, early warnings, in terms of post-disaster solutions. But we still have those gaps. So I think what I'm trying to really figure out and say is I don't know whether there could be a centralized structure in terms of a framework which will assimilate all these networks together and say, okay, these are the great points and then put them together. Okay, and how do we best utilize it? Now, look at internet. If it was regulated, we would not have seen the proliferation of internet, the way people have used it and taken to it. So even people who we call illiterates are not really illiterates because most of them use mobile phones. Okay, what we are seeing is, in fact, the slum that I was talking about, where I provided them a training curriculum in 3 languages, which is used in that locality: English, Hindi, and Marathi. Okay, and when I checked, they said, "Oh, we use English." Now they are the so-called marginalized people. I'm not using the word poor because they have cash, and they said English. Okay, so I realized another factor, which is like what Meghan was talking about. Don't assume. Go and work with the community, and you will understand the requirements that will come up and how they think and how they act. They said we use English because that's the escalation language, and that's the global language for communication. So it really helps to understand what people need and then build our frameworks around that instead of working on a top-down. I think most of our policy making is top-down, which is also affecting the penetration of internet. We need to kind of go grounds up, bottoms up, in terms of how we prepare our policy. So mainstreaming the communities into a policy planning process is the way to go, I guess. That's where probably we could start to make a little difference.
Good point. Anyone who wants to add? Or we have another question.
I just want to add one thing. Of course, there are free apps available in mobile, but not all the mobile apps will be available for free. Everybody provides mobile app for free. Then how they are going to make money? Because these people who are making mobile apps, one of their goals is to make some money for their living also. Of course, we can use these mobile apps that are available for free for many things. But like I have been saying, we need to have some program or training program or awareness program or whatever you say, literacy program to make people learn what to use, how to use from the applications that are available. Like we can also have like a mobile app for the disaster management, things like that. So those types of things, all kind of app can be used, and we need to, it will take time for people to learn it, but they will learn it, I'm sure.
Thank you.
See, interaction helps, to kind of think. I was talking about the police network and we were referring to that. I mean, just an idea that there's a police network which is present in all the areas, geography. They have penetration, right, in terms of business. And there's a network, and they use a radio network. Now, could that network possibly be used to set up a public interest system in every village? Where if there's an impending disaster, you could actually then address the community at large using a public interest system, using the police network at the back end to warn people of an impending disaster and be prepared for it. So those are the kind of methods that we need to follow. We are doing it, right? Already doing it. Okay.
Good. So, yes. This would be the last question because
thank you very much. I am agree with the previous speakers in some aspect, like we are not poor, but we think like this. So for that point, I am agree that Nepalese are not poor, but their policy maker maybe their mindset may be poor. First thing is that. Second thing is that there is nothing wrong in the free. I am here free because somebody is sponsoring there. So this is my responsibility to think in the mind, put in the mind that if I am getting something free and somebody is sponsoring there, then my responsibility to act like that so that that sponsor should generate more revenue, and then they will sponsor to the other poor. So before helping to the poor, I should be rich. And we have to we don't think that we have to think as a poor. We have to think about how to become rich. Once I become rich, I will help more to the poor. So in the disaster recovery case, I'm going to connect to the things that if we don't have enough fund to manage disaster recovery ourselves, so many donors companies are there, we have to handshake with them and we have to utilize their resources, public partner resources. For that, we want to think that somebody, if I have not capacity to drive Pajero, if somebody comes and gives me Pajero, if I accept the Pajero, I will be lost the whole property within 5 to 10 years. So we have to accept those things only freely that can be survived, but that we can maintain in the future. In the disaster recovery case, what is happening here, there is so many commercial organizations there, but they are not generating more revenue to protect us. If they generate more revenue, then they will invest more to the disaster recovery, they will spend the money to the disaster recovery, and we will, at the same time, like for example, Facebook, Fiverr, they are helped this time in the last year, the disaster recovery case, Fiverr is helped. But what the Fiverr is getting? Fiverr is getting from the advertisement. How many rich person is going to purchase the things that is advertised in the Fiverr? So we have to, another thing is that the big disaster in the ICT is the piracy. And another thing is that we are all people are talking about the open source technology, free technology, and again we are expecting help somebody, sponsorship for somebody. First we have to avoid that we should not use the pirated things. We should not use the open technology, at least in the commercial organization. Because if they use open source technology, the revenue is not going to be generated, then we are not going to get any help from anywhere, because nobody is going to help you freely. So in this way, we have to thought, first we think that what I am getting, it is my responsibility. If I am getting here freely, it is my responsibility to act like that in future. So we should Nepal Telecom, what a web server, these types of companies should get some revenue at least through my activity. Thank you, sir.
Very good point, sir. And I can see that this conference is now gearing up. And you see, when you start driving the car, you put the first gear and then you start accelerating. So I can see that now we are on the second gear. We still have to reach to the fourth gear once we finish this conference this evening. Interesting discussion, and thank you very much to all my panelists. In fact, we have a lot of other discussion and there are a lot of questions coming in my mind as well. But we still have 2 more sessions after the lunch. So please stay with us. There are a lot of other learning important points coming up with regards to using of ICT for disaster management, relief, recovery, and response. With that, again, I'd like to thank you all of my panelists, and I would like to request if you can give them a big round of applause for putting a lot of interesting aspects. And with that, I'll pass it on to Santosh.
Thank you. And one more round of applause for our moderator for driving for Naveed. Now we are in the last minute of the first panel discussion, and before we